We found a tear wound of nearly 1 centimeter on the girl's lower body. There might be DNA if there was rape, so I carefully used a cotton swab to sample and sealed it in a bag. The autopsy of the 2 corpses took more than 5 hours. The boy had a clear upward strangulation mark on his neck, and his eyes and trachea also had corresponding suffocation reactions. The cause of death was suffocation. Some of his finger bones were also fractured. According to the bruise marks, it should have been caused by his own attempt to break the rope. There were some beatings on his body, but much lighter than the girl, and there was no major internal bleeding. The boy's time of death should be 1 to 2 hours earlier than the girl. The time of the children's murder was probably about 15 days ago. The soil near the scene where the bodies were found had no traces of blood infiltration, and even no dripping blood was found. This should be the dumping site. The dumping site was chosen very well, away from the highway, no surveillance cameras, and the burial location was rarely visited by villagers. From this, it can be determined that the murderer should be quite familiar with this place, and very likely a local. The 2 children were not light in weight, and most of the people who could dump the bodies were young and strong laborers, and they also had to have transportation. I also found that the children's trousers and shoes had cement. They probably passed through a place with cement, such as a construction site, a newly built house, or even such a place might be the first scene. The 2 children were covered with wounds and the methods were cruel. The purpose was clear, which was to torture. The murderer must have a grudge against the 2 children or their family. After dawn, we rushed to the home of the siblings. This was a 2-story building in the middle of Baigwa village. Compared with most of the bungalows in the village, this building looked relatively decent, but the house was quite old, and the exposed walls had mold spots. From a distance, I saw a lot of wreaths at their door, and there were people crying. I wondered if they had a funeral so soon. As soon as I entered the door, there was a black and white portrait on the table, but it was not the 2 children, but an old lady. The uncle of Li Tong and Li Bin, the siblings, came out to greet us. He told us that just last night, the grandmother of the siblings hanged herself. She died too violently and had to be buried simply. In the yard, a new coffin was still being painted hastily. There were many old people in their 50s and 60s in the hall, all of whom came to attend the funeral. Baigwa village had a small population, and most of the young and strong laborers went out to work, and even the funeral could not come to a few young people. The children's uncle told us that the siblings were left behind children and had been taken care of by their grandparents. On July 26, after the 2 elders found that the children were missing, they first mobilized the whole village to search the mountains for 2 days and 2 nights, and then they thought that the children might have been trafficked, and the children's parents ran to other provinces following the clues, but they suddenly received the bad news yesterday. The children's grandfather had completely collapsed emotionally and only knew how to repeat, "I told them to come back early and pay attention to safety." They were so good, how could they have a grudge with others? They were all little kids. Seeing that we couldn't ask anything, we had to say goodbye. When we went out and helped them close the door, we used a little force and the door was pulled off, and we apologized again. On the way back, I asked my colleagues, "Do you think this family is telling the truth?" My colleague said, "What is there to doubt?" I shook my head and couldn't say it. The children were killed, and then the children's grandmother committed suicide, so extreme, and even before we could ask any more information. This always makes people feel a bit strange. When someone is killed, the first suspect is the closest person. I don't want to think like this, but I have to think like this.